Okay, I guess we will start. We are on Swiss time. Well, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you. I look around the panel and I'm in awe with the collected expertise gathered here. My name is Peter Zimmerli and I'm the Consulate General of Switzerland in Atlanta. It is my privilege and pleasure to welcome you to this webinar and the virtual vernissage of the exhibit Material Shapes the Ages that has been created by the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, which some of you might know better by its acronym ETH. I'm curious to hear from the ETH researchers what new materials are being developed. How will they look like? What can we do with them? And especially, what impact will they have on our lives? We are honored to have Julia Carpenter and Nicole Kleger with us today to talk about their innovative work on complex materials. Some fascinating 60 minutes lie ahead of us. Prepare yourself to be challenged, excited, and inspired. I'm also excited because it's the first time that the Swiss Consulate General is participating in the Atlanta Design Festival. We are so happy to be part of this festival, and I wish to thank Elaine DeLeo for the partnership and support. And it makes me proud that we start right away with a high-class webinar with top researchers talking about an urgent topic. And to moderate this talk, we are honored to have another experienced and extremely successful public speaker and communicator, Susan Kish. At the forefront of the global climate change movement, Susan Kish is a catalyst for change and creating a positive environmental impact. She's a seasoned business executive, entrepreneur, director, and marketer, working at the intersection of sustainability, disruptive technologies, and the evolving energy system. A facilitator, moderator, and public speaker, Susan connects people and innovative ideas with a focus on driving change at industries in transition. Susan is a member of the board of directors and trustees on several boards and advises early stage technology companies in the US, in Switzerland, Germany, Spain, and the UK. Susan is a Connection Science Fellow at MIT and a member of the ETH Circle. Before I hand over to Susan Kish, I want to say once more, on behalf of the Consulate General of Switzerland in Atlanta and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, welcome. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. And with this, over to you, Susan.
You know, as they say, you have to always turn off your mute button before you start. And Peter, thank you very much for an extremely kind introduction. Welcome to everyone. Welcome to those who are joining us today, wherever you are. We're delighted to be having our first virtual vernissage, Material Shapes the Ages. I'm Susan Kish, and over the next hour, we're going to take a virtual tour of an exhibition where the artists are the scientists and the researchers of ETH. The ETH, or the Swiss Institute of Technology, is regularly ranked amongst the top universities in the world, with 23,000 students from 120 countries, 520 members of the faculty, and over 20 Nobel laureates, including, if I could mention, Albert Einstein. I'm going to be joined, as Peter mentioned, by two of the doctoral students. These scientists are in the Department of Materials. They're going to give us a guide, an annotated guide to the 10 materials that we're going to dig into over the next hour, who each of these materials has the potential to shape the future. I'd like to introduce Julia Carpenter, who is in that department and will be joining me on stage, so to speak. Hi, Julia. And Nicole Kleger, also joining me on stage, so to speak. Hi, Nicole, how are you? Welcome to both of you. For everyone who's joined us, we have a chat that's open. If you have questions, please just enter them on as they arise. And one of our colleagues in Zurich, Victoria Iverson, is going to collect those, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end to address those. And for anybody who's interested, this session is recorded. So why is it that we're looking at materials, and why are we looking at them now? So Julia, from your perspective, we talked about this a little bit the other day. Why material science, and what is it about materials that captivated you?
So one of the interesting things about materials is they're everywhere. We touch them every day. We interact with them all the time, but we rarely think about how they got where they are right now. And if we think of it, the materials we use and how we shape them has a profound impact on how we live and how we act and interact with each other. There's a reason we call it the Stone Age and the Bronze Age and now the Silicon Age. It's because these materials define our cultures, and yet we rarely really think about how they were made or how we could change them. And I think that's fascinating.
Excellent. Thank you. And Nicole, I'm going to ask you the other part of this question, which is, what is it about 2021 that says this is the time we should really focus on materials and where they're going?
Well, I think we can actually add on what Julia just said. So one of the biggest challenges that we are facing today is the climate change. And these problems can at least partially be solved by substantial evolution of the materials. Also, again, how the ages are named. And then there is the other big challenge of the aging population and all the medical impact that implants could have for osteoporosis and so on. And I think also there, if we advance in materials, we can actually have a big impact on today's society.
So it sounds like sort of the perfect storm. We're having a lot of advances on the science and the materials and physics and 3D printing. And on the other side, there's a lot of urgency to this. And you see this through the whole chain, right? It's not just the research you guys are doing. It's the investors, the venture capital investors, the large incumbents. They're all looking at these kinds of questions.
Yes,
exactly.
They really are. So it's an exciting time to be a material scientist.
Well put. So we're going to start our tour by asking you, our audience, to think about materials. As Julia said, we rarely sort of think of what it is we're looking at. And Victoria, if you could put up the slide with the poll, that would be great. We're going to ask each of you to open up a screen. You can either take your phone and take a picture of that QR code that's on the screen, or navigate to menti.com and enter the code there. And I think that Victoria has also entered a link into the chat. So you got 3 ways to help us. But think through, what is it that makes, this is the little bottle that I use to water the plants. Okay, you can't see them here, but I do actually have plants someplace else. What is it that makes these colorful pens, right? Why are they special? What makes them distinct? And I have one of these little I don't even know what this is called. I think it tells you the temperature. But all these things are things we have just touching every day that really make a difference in terms of how we are. So just open up that screen and start to enter the kinds of adjectives. It's fluorescent, it is liquid, it is glass, it's transparent, it's soft, it's fuzzy, it's flexible, it's recyclable. I'm starting to fill in the blank for you, but if you could start filling those in, that would be great. And Julia and Nicole, please don't hesitate to also do this, right? You guys think about this all the time, right? As you almost design materials backwards. What are the qualities we want? And then how do we get there? So if everybody could just take a few minutes, ooh, bendy, that's cool. Thermal resistant, biomimetic. I wonder what that is. Tensile strength. Recyclable seems to be a favorite. And again, if you go to menti.com and the code is 7896 7937. You could just do it on your phone. It's incredibly easy, or you can navigate on a browser and you can put in up to 10 different adjectives. Recyclable seems to still be one of the most favorite on this. We're going to leave that open for a few more minutes. Living, that's cool. Bendy. Skin friendly, okay, cool, magnetic, flexible, soft, strong. And in your answers, they don't have to be unique. You can also reflect what you've seen so far on the screen. I'm going to leave it open for just 30 more seconds just to get a few more words into there. Lightweight. Soft. Super. I'm going to close this one now. Keep it up on the screen. And Nicole, anything on here that you see as these words continue to bounce around that either you are surprised by or you've actually had to design a material in your research to achieve that kind of quality?
Biodegradable. Huh,
Yes,
Nicole?
exactly. So we actually work with magnesium, which is a lightweight metal which degrades in the body. So biodegradable is actually something which is really close. And for sure, as a material scientist, I think it's really important that we always have the recyclability and the environmental friendliness at the front of our heads, really, whenever we design new materials.
Julia, what about you?
Well, I recently worked with something that was magnetic and soft. It was so
Magnetic
soft.
and
It could,
soft? That's wild.
yeah, I used it to pick up a raspberry. It's really cool.
Raspberries. So how could you, all right, so you have to explain this just a little bit more.
Okay.
How would you, because I never think of raspberries as particularly magnetic, so.
So no. The raspberry is not magnetic, but what I made is like a little gripper. So a tool that can grip something that's very soft. And if you have a magnetic field around, it will grip the raspberry and you can transport it without squishing it. So that's where the raspberry comes in. It's just the thing we lift with our little soft magnetic material.
That is very, very cool. Very cool. Well, listen, now that everybody on the screen who's joined us today is, starting to think like a material scientist, we're going to start our tour. And we're going to start our tour with the medical applications for many of these. We have 2 videos we're going to show and share with all of you that talk about this in a very particular way. David, if you could run those 2 videos, please.
Implant and forget. These bone implants are made from the world's purest magnesium. It is first distilled and then specifically alloyed with small quantities of other biocompatible elements like calcium and zinc. Magnesium implants degrade in the human body after healing, so there is no need for surgery to remove any screws or plates. And, just as a benefit, magnesium actually stimulates bone growth. Sold template. 3D printing has led to a paradigm shift in the world of design, but many high-performance materials are incompatible with printing. Water-soluble, printed sold templates give these materials, like magnesium, access to complex lattice structures. This unlocks their potential to heal bone, make lighter space shuttles, or efficient cooling systems.
Thank you. And Nicole, you're quite the star in these videos. Very impressed. But in that last video, the white sort of framework, that was the salt, and the red stuff that popped up so dramatically, I noticed it was Swiss colors. That was the magnesium. And then what, you washed away the salt, or how did that actually work?
Yeah, actually, so the red stuff was actually a silicon, but in principle, we can also do it with magnesium. So this is the cool thing about the process, that it's so versatile and it can be used with a wide range of materials. And on your question, yes, exactly. So the white stuff is just salt, and you can just wash it away under the tap. And drain it down the sink. Again, back to environmentally friendliness, I think also there it's important to consider what we flush down our sinks.
So, and is the salt passive in terms of the materials it interacts with, or does it interact with the magnesium, or how do you figure out what you can pour into this mold once you got the mold in place?
Yes, exactly. So this is actually why we chose salt, because it's super stable, also at high temperature. Sodium and chloride, they love each other. So they really stick together for as long as they can, and they won't interact with anything else. But what they really love is water, right? So this is why we can dissolve it in the end, but it won't interact with any material that we infiltrate.
So, well, how did you come up with the idea around the implants and forget? What was the journey of figuring that out?
So magnesium has been investigated as an implant material actually even before steel and titanium came up, which people tend to forget. And however, there were challenges about the degradability, and with material science progressing, we've now an understanding how the material degrades, and we can tune the properties that it doesn't degrade too fast. And with that, magnesium implants have actually reached the market about 5 years ago. However, there has not been a technique to properly structure magnesium in scaffolds as the one you saw in red. And this would be interesting because it would allow the bone to grow into the scaffold, and the scaffold degrades, like the magnesium scaffold degrades once the bone has fully grown again. And this was the challenge I was facing in the beginning of my master thesis, and we came up with the process of printing salt to get the magnesium in this lattice structure to support bone growth.
You
Maybe
also
tell the people.
I'm
Sorry.
Julia.
Maybe
Go
just
ahead.
tell the people real quick what happens if magnesium dissolves too quickly, because that is interesting.
Yeah, this is actually what happened when they started looking at magnesium. So they put magnesium together with a steel screw, and this is a galvanic coupling. So the degradation of magnesium goes really fast, and hydrogen gas is produced, and this makes like bubbles underneath the skin from hydrogen gas, which is really like there are mice pictures with these bubbles. So it's not nice to see.
Unintended consequences. So you have to really finesse this kind of application. You also mentioned that it could be used for burns. How does that work?
For burns, no, for bones. Sorry, that's my
Oh.
Australian accent probably that was going for burns rather than bones. But I'm looking for applications for burns. That would be also interesting for sure.
Very cool. What are the other kind of medical applications that are exciting within the field outside of the two that we saw around salt and around the salt template and around the implants?
I mean, going for the burns you just said, for example, there is a startup in Zurich which is growing really heavily now. They produced skin templates, or they can grow actually human skin in vitro and then transplant it. So this is a really important topic. Or also, for example, small nanoparticles which can clean your blood to prevent sepsis. So I think there is a whole range, and it all boils down in the end to materials which do a job in some engineering context in the end.
Do you have physicians within your department in material science, or how do you figure out where the problems are that you're trying to solve? Or do you walk across the street to the Unispital and say, gosh, what's the problem?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of various things. So sometimes it's actually the industry that is approaching the groups or the professors. Sometimes it's professors that are really working close to the industry who are looking for specific problems. But also quite often it happens that we make some material in the lab, and some people pick up on the publication, for example, and say, hey, this would be really a cool material to solve our challenge, which I think is really great about materials, because you're not stuck in one industry, but you can actually invent something which can be used for something completely else. So for example, the titanium implants have been used for, or have been developed for space applications, and they're now actually used as implant materials.
So Nicole, how did you start doing this? Because my bet is you didn't sort of wake up one day when you were 12 years old and say, I want to grow up and be a material scientist. So, well, maybe you did, but how did you pick this as the way you wanted to pursue your academic career? and to get your PhD in?
You mean the topic or the material science as a
Material
whole?
science writ large, the big department. How did you pick that department and that area to pursue?
Yeah. So like, it's actually funny because you have physics and chemistry and maths at school, but you never hear about material science. So I was at an ETH day where they presented all the different study directions. And actually by accident, I dropped into a class where they presented about the studies in material science. And I just thought this is super cool because it combines so many different aspects. And as a cherry on top, the people there were really cool. So
That is a wonderful combination. Cool. Julia, from your perspective, anything to add around the sort of medical world of applications?
Well, what I think is really interesting in the medical world, especially, is that actually scientists are at least 10 to 15 years ahead of what's being used in clinics and in the medicinal industry, because there's such a long FDA approval process, etc. There's so many clinical studies. So surprisingly often, scientists know more about where really we need to work than the occasional doctor, or at least our views go apart. So we think this is the big issues and the doctors think this is the big issue. And then maybe sometimes we find a way to overlap. But I think that's really something exciting, that we are actually so far ahead of what you see when you go to a hospital.
Very cool. Very cool.
A preview of what's happening.
That's right. It's the future is here, just unevenly distributed, as Michael would say. Thank you. So we're going to switch now to our second group of exhibits, which is around sustainability, which you've heard as a theme throughout this conversation. And David, if you could run those two videos, please, that would be great.
A modern tree. Aerogels are amongst the lightest materials in the world. They mainly consist of air. Due to its finely branched structure, 1 gram of this highly porous material has the same surface area as 2 tennis courts. This specific titanium aerogel enables artificial photosynthesis. Like a tree, it converts CO2 and water into valuable energy, simply by using sunlight. White and flexible wood. Wood consists of cellulose fibers and a glue called lignin. Lignin removal is a common procedure to produce paper, but it disrupts the order of the fibers. Using a novel process, the natural structure and beneficial fiber directionality of the wood can be fully retained. This results in a white, flexible wood that can be deformed when wet. When compressed and impregnated with a resin, it turns into a natural, high-performance fiber composite.
Reborn from ashes. Industrial waste, such as fly ash, is often abandoned. However, it can be recycled to produce a type of foam that combines excellent insulation with sustainability. It is non-flammable and fully recyclable. This invention embraces the circular economy and envisions a future of resource-efficient building.
So thank you. Really interesting ones, whether they're trees or microplastics. Anyway, Julian, will you start us off? What makes these three guide us through this part of the exhibit?
So, well, I'm going to start with the ashes one, because that's the one I'm most familiar with, because this started as a master project. So I did this in my master. It started out, instead of ash, it started out with clay. So I was doing a course in the architecture department for some easy credits, because at a certain point you just want easy credits in your studies. And we went and we played with earth and building with earth. And I realized earth is a material, which is obvious to everybody, what was kind of new to me. And I knew about this foaming, how to foam something. So I took the earth and I foamed it, and well, it worked. And so this whole process moved on, and it has a lot of very cool properties because it's cheap, it's incredibly sustainable, it can be sourced on location. So basically you can, when you're building your house, first you dig for the fundament, for the basement and everything. So you have your clay ready, and then you just foam it and make your own insulation. So it's like the ideal example of going back to the basics, but making something very fancy with it.
Now, is the way you make foam, is that the same thing that, you know, in fancy restaurants they make foam, or how do you actually make foam?
So to make foam is basically you need a soap.
Huh.
So you need some, we call it a surfactant because we're fancy, but it's a soap, and then you mix it mechanically, you whip it up, and it starts getting stable. And if you have something like clay in it, which is particulates, then it gets really stiff and you can shape it into all kinds of things. It's like making a mousse.
Like making a mousse. And then how do you make it solidify? How do you make, because, you know, from
You
the
dry
video,
it.
it seems that it's solid.
So you dry it in shape. So you make a very, very stable foam, like your egg whites. And when you like when you're making a meringue, right?
Yeah.
And you whip your egg whites with sugar, and then you put them in the oven and they dry exactly in the shape you had them. It's the same with earth. So we're making a meringue with earth, and that can be used as insulation.
Very, very, very cool. Nicole, I'm going to ask you about those tree things, right? This concept that you have something that's like 1 gram and then spreads out to 2 tennis courts is just, I'm not going to say ridiculous, but it's really impressive. How about that? That's a more professional term. So can you talk about that?
Yes, exactly. So this is the cool thing about aerogel. So it's nanoparticles, which are like super, super tiny small. And you basically line them up in a kind of jewelry fashion. And this makes this really huge surface area in the end. The drawback these aerogels have, at least initially, is that they are very brittle, but also their material science has advanced the whole area. And now we get quite, or at least a bit less brittle aerogels, but we're still working on that. Exactly.
So what would you use that for? It's cool, but how do you use it?
So I think that the coolness really comes from these huge surface areas. So there are a lot of chemical reactions that happen at the surface of a material, right? So like catalysis. So if you think about the, how do you call that in English? The catalysator, the thing in your car, catalyst in your car, exactly. Which makes sure that there are no awful chemicals coming out of your car. This all happens on the surface of the material. And if you manage to put such a huge surface area in such a small and lightweight piece of material, you get really a high output of this chemical reaction. And I think this is amazing about aerogels.
Very cool. I mean, you're right. There are a lot of climate related, whether it's in the catalyzer of your car or capturing methane emissions at a refinery or whatever, where surface area really makes a difference. Cool. Exactly. And talk about the wood, right? Which you, if I understand correctly, you sort of, then you add resin, which sounds like another kind of glue, and then you put it into a mold and you get neat shapes. So what was special about that?
So again, I think it's our duty to make materials more environmentally friendly, and we need to use things that are renewable, such as wood. However, like I think our lifestyles nowadays is asking for advanced materials. So somehow we need to bridge this gap between like high-tech materials and what we have around us. And I think that this wood is a perfect example where we are replacing the glue, simply the glue in this whole structure, and just make the material much stronger, and that we can use it as a high-end material in the end.
Can you use it, you know, could you make it in such quantities that you can use it for construction?
I think in principle, yes. We would have to think though where it makes sense, right? This is also, you know, like it's the same with 3D printing. It's everywhere, but like we need to think where it makes sense to put this effort in. So in normal construction, I think wood already at this itself is a really awesome material, and I would say we should use it there as it is for construction material. However, there are other applications where we are looking for really, really strong materials which need to be super light, and there I think it's the perfect place to use it.
Like what? Airplanes?
Yeah, for example. Exactly.
Cars as well. Car doors is one of the examples they show. Helmets, for instance, instead of having a plastic helmet, you can have your delignified wood helmet, nice and white.
Yeah, I can
be a good
see
application.
That. Very, very cool. In terms of sustainable and recyclable and things that really extend the life and husband the resources that we have, what other areas are you guys really interested in? What do you think the development is going to be?
So for me personally, I'm really interested in end of life cycles. So not even on developing a new material, but in seeing how we can recycle it, because recycling is not that easy. We know for certain materials we can do it well, for steel, for aluminum, but for other materials such as plastics, it's actually quite complicated, and a lot of it is still done by hand. So that's what makes it really expensive. So finding ways to recycle material or just to tweak them slightly to make them easier to recycle, I think that's fascinating.
Very cool.
But it's also something we need to think of when we design the material, right? Because like it's actually starts at the beginning of your material. We need to start already thinking, okay, what's going to happen at the end with this material?
Right.
I think that's generally the problem.
Yeah.
Right.
So one of the things that, as we were talking in advance about this, we were talking about plastics, right? Which is in many ways just a miracle fabric material, the whole bit. But plastics is a wonderful example also of unintended consequences. We have an image we'd like to share. This is an image we've all seen a million times, which is of plastic waste, right? The number of bottles that we use, the difficulty in recycling, Julia, which goes to your point, and the islands floating in the Pacific that compose this. And this is really a fabulous example of not really understanding the life cycle of the material, and not understanding how to do that. So for our last section, our last tour, our last stops on our tour, we're going to talk about smart materials and how is plastic something we should write off completely, or is there such a thing as smart plastic? So David, if you could throw on the screen our last videos, that would be great. Thank you, David.
Printed strength. Liquid crystal polymers are standard materials used for electrical connectors. 3D printing of these LCPs improves their microstructure. This makes them much stronger. They show superior temperature stability and chemical resistance and survive in the harshest application environment.
Weakness illuminated. These Swiss Army knives are coated with a solid-state optical sensor that tracks even the smallest change in the material by changing its color. Just by the color, you can tell whether they've worn off and which temperatures they've been exposed to. Such color sensors enable real-time tracking of hard-to-reach devices. They can show whether an airplane turbine is overheating or if the blades of an offshore wind farm have worn off. Sprinting magnetic memories. These nanometer-thin magnetic multilayers are patterned on a silicon wafer. They combine the best of two worlds, non-volatile data storage and electronic speed. Magnetic random access memories will deliver instant on-off computing, nanosecond read and write times, and reduced power consumption. Big Bang in a multiferroic crystal. Multiferroics are a new type of material, crystals to be exact. They combine magnetic and electric properties in a unique way. This can be useful for building novel electronic devices, for example, computers with ultra-low power consumption. But multiferroics can do more. Their pattern of electric charges simulates processes that happened in the early universe, right after the Big Bang.
All right, that was a very cool roundup. Okay, those are very, very, very cool. So let's start with the printed strength. Nicole, how did you come up with this idea? You are an incredibly active athlete. Was this because you were, trying to climb and find something lighter to take with you in your backpack, or how did that come up with?
So actually, it was a researcher in our group who's also doing a startup on this. So check it out if you have the time. So they were looking again for polymers with really high performance. So I think this is an important point if we talk about sustainability, that polymers are not per se bad, but it's how they're used nowadays. And they're not used for their properties, but actually because they're so cheap. So coming back to the printed strength, what we use there, it's the polymer we print. When it cools down quickly, it makes a fiber-like texture, even though it's just polymer. And these fibers kind of make these really strong materials. So similar to carbon fibers, which are really strong, these pneumatic crystals also make the same thing. And the cool thing about it, compared to, or in contrast to carbon fiber composites, is that they're fully recyclable. So they can just be melted again, and you can print them again and reuse it. So you don't have waste, really.
So a couple questions. Can you define what is a polymer? What does that actually mean?
Good question. So a polymer, like, I guess people usually talk about plastics, but a polymer is, chemically speaking, an array of mostly the same small molecule, just repeated in an awful lot amount. So we also talk about kind of spaghettis. So you'll have like the spaghettis which are entwined somehow, and this is the polymer. So one spaghetti is a polymer chain, and then the whole thing is, yeah.
The best example here.
Go ahead.
I'm always interested. The best example here is polyethylene. So polyethylene starts as very small, and then it grows longer, and you have propane that you use to fire your camping stove, and then it grows a bit longer, and at a certain point you have paraffin, like your candles, your paraffin candles, and then you grow it even longer, and at a certain point it becomes a plastic bag. So it's just the same thing you repeat over and over and over, and the longer it is, the different properties come up.
Oh,
so
cool.
It's chemically very similar. Your propane and your plastic bag are almost the same. One is long and one is short, but otherwise it's the same.
Very, very cool. So for this clip, right, for the climbing clip that you showed, has it similar qualities in terms of, you know, durability and strength and ability not to sort of break when you're hanging from a cliff that you would in a steel clip?
Yes, from the strength point of view, it's really similar. I think durability, they're still running tests, but it has been used in a lot of applications, also for space applications, actually. So it's really stable also in harsh conditions with chemicals. You can print it vacuum tight, which again is interesting also for space applications. So it's a really durable material overall. Yes, it is.
Very, very cool. Let's go to the next one, which was our Swiss Army knife example, which I thought was so cool, Julia. And of course, I'm sitting here thinking wine bottles, which you just do not want to have exposed over time, and other kinds of applications to it. That was just one, of course. But how did you come up with this idea of changing color that way with weaknesses or different materials?
I mean, this is another project that came out of our department, so I was not directly involved. I'm just giving you a sneak peek. So the background here is that color can derive out of multiple things. So we usually know pigments, right? What we paint with, what we use to dye clothes, or these kinds of things. But there's different ways of producing color. It's how matter, like materials, interact with light. An example is the structural color, which we use for these really bright birds and butterflies, the blue butterflies. They have a way where they just make color through structure, no pigments. The pigment in a peacock's tail is brown. So if you grind it down, a peacock's feathers, they're brown. But color itself, those beautiful shiny colors, they just come from the structure. And this is the same type of idea for this. We use the structure of a material to give color. And so here there's two materials, and depending on the temperature, they're either mixed really well or they demix. And so that's how over temperature you can see a change in color by having a demixing of these two materials. So it's a really high-tech process. These are very, very thin layers, again, nanometer scale, so
right,
tiny.
And how long, let's say something went to the level where it turned blue. Does that blue last for a long time, right? Long enough for somebody to go, oh, look at that wind turbine, it turned blue.
The blue will last until you heat it to a higher temperature. So otherwise it's permanent. So that's really cool. Yes, that's why
That is
it's
really cool.
it's the perfect indicator of what has been happening.
So the last two videos around sprinting, magnetic memories, and the bang both seem to have enormous applications in terms of the hardware behind computers and server farms and all those areas. How does the magnetic memories, what is so specifically interesting around those materials?
So at the moment, what we're using for RAM, so that's the memory in your computer that when your computer crashes, it forgets everything you've been typing in your Word document, and the thing that really annoys you, that's RAM. And RAM at the moment is done electronically. So it needs a constant supply of electricity to keep its memory. Crash, no electricity, done. Magnetic memory is permanent. So as soon as you write something, it will remain there. And we had that before in hard drives. Hard drives are magnetic, but they're very slow and clunky. So this is a new development of making magnetic RAM so quick and efficient as electronic, but permanent. And of course, that needs less energy because you don't have to have this constant upkeep of your memory. It will just, you open a tab and your computer will remember it till the end of days.
That's wild. And do you need, is there any form of energy that's required to make that, to activate that? Or
so
you need to
write it, right? You need to write, is it up or down? Is it plus or minus? Is it 1 or 0? That's what you need to write. But once you've written it, it's done. And electronically, you have to repeat this. You have to tell them, remember, you're 1, you're still 1, you're still 1, you're still 1. And that's something you don't have to do with the magnetic memory.
Very, very cool. And the last one, the bang in the multiferroic crystal. Let's start with what is multiferroic, because you talked about it and explained it, but I'm not quite sure I understand what makes this really so special.
So multiferroics is a fairly new type of material. It's about 20 years old. It was developed by a professor here at ETH. And it's a really special kind of material, very fancy, hard to understand even for us that spent hours studying it. But the basics is we have ferromagnetic materials, so materials that can keep a magnetic moment. In our MRAMs, we have something like that. And we have materials that are ferroelectric, which can keep an electric polarization. And these materials, these multiferroics, they can do both. And that's incredibly special because then you can use an electric field, use electricity to inscribe a magnetic memory. Usually you always need a magnetic field, and that can have so many impacts on making computers smaller and quicker and more efficient.
And is it possible, or what stage is a material like that? Is this something you're talking to the large manufacturers of big computers and the stuff that goes into data farms, or how did that work?
So we'd love to do that. At the moment, it only works when it's cooled. So only at -70 degrees or so. So while it is
-70 Celsius, is that right?
Yes, Celsius. So I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but let's say it's liquid nitrogen. So it's very, very, very cold.
That is a constraint.
That's perfectly fine for labs. That is even perfectly fine for very special, very high-end computers, but it's not something you want to have at home. So at the moment, that's where there's lots of research happening, trying to make them work also at room temperature.
Very cool. What other developments are you seeing around this concept of smart materials with their applications that really either Nicole or Julia, that you think is really interesting? Maybe Julia, you could start.
So we see a lot of materials, we call this 4D printing, that can change shape after you've processed them. So for instance, materials that swell and then change from something flat into a flower shape, or these kinds of materials. I think they're fascinating because depending on changing environments, they can change their shape or their properties. And that way you have something that's really useful over multiple applications, or useful when it rains, and when the sun shines, it always works. So these kinds of materials I find amazing, but they're very hard to do because you have to combine so many things. Very cool. Nicole?
I think I'm going in the same line. So like facing again back to climate change, so where we started, I think these materials are really cool because you don't need energy input from the outside. So also if we talk about, for example, these soft robots, which do a movement or something just by some trigger from the environment. I think this is fascinating, and this is something we need. So, for example, there was an example from, I think it was the BAU, so the construction department, where they developed some how do you call it? Not screens,
Ceiling?
roof ceilings that close and open up depending on like the sunshine.
Cool.
Also similar to the pine cone when it opens and closes with the rain and humidity. So I think these things are really cool, and it's really also what we need today.
Very cool. So Nicole, I'm sorry, Julia, I never heard from you how you ended up in the materials department, because it doesn't sound like you ended up, it sounded like you consciously chose. So how did you select that department?
So I always knew I would want to be either a doctor or go to ETH. But ETH is a big institution and there's many things to study here. And so I looked through the catalog basically. And I really fell in love with material science, mostly because it combines everything. I'm one of those people, I like to do everything. I took Latin in high school and ancient Greek, and I like to paint and I like to sew and I like material science. So for me, that was perfect. Something that Nicole also is one of those people who does everything. She sings and she cooks and she does lots of sports. So we're like kind of all rounders. So material science for me was really something where I felt I could like let my own roundedness really flourish and play a bit with chemistry, with physics, with biology, and really just be at a interface of what is happening.
Nicole, where do you see material science going? Right? It sounds like it's at a really interesting pivot point where it's going to have sort of a disproportionate impact on our futures. But in 10 years, what do you think will be the burning questions that material science is going to look at?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I think the whole plastic problem will be certainly a point, which is, and also the recycling problem that goes one in hand. And the other thing is, I think the whole data storage challenge, like how we store information in the digital world. I think this will also boil down to a material science problem, which will be one of the big challenges to solve for us.
And so data storage 100 years ago was probably pretty easy. It was like paper, right? And that was
yes, exactly. I mean, I lately saw a TV show actually where they were discussing on I think it was in Iceland or something, where they built these huge sub-ground treasure things where they store and they discuss on how you can store information for really a long period of time. Because if you think about the USB flash, first of all, the information on a flash drive will be lost at some point. And the other thing is, will people in 100 years time be still able to read this data? So I think they're to figure out how we can store this and on what kind of material we can store it. I think this will be a super exciting thing to come.
Julia?
So I really agree. The storage is amazing. And there's ideas of storing in DNA and these kinds of things. But what I'm really excited about is I'm hoping and I'm guessing that soon there will be lots of new rules about dealing with climate change. And I think as soon as these come into place, lots of companies will be coming to us and asking us, can you help us fulfill this recyclable rule? Or can you help us reduce our carbon footprint? And I'm really excited to start then working with these companies and see where we can really help them. At the moment, the problem is research is expensive and lots of things are very cheap to do. But as soon as they aren't that cheap to do anymore, people will be coming to us and asking us to find solutions. And there will be so much to do in the next 10 years, I feel like.
So what, we talked about this a little bit. What makes plastics so special and so cheap? Because I think our discussion was really saying that they're so cheap to make and so flexible that it's really hard for us to envision a future where it isn't part, despite its difficulty in being recycled or renewed or whatever you want to call it, it's going to be part of how we live going forward. How do we balance those two conflicting, the desire to have something cheap and flexible raises the quality of life with the fact that it's so hard to get rid of? Nicole, you're nodding your head.
Yes, so I think it's different. So it's several different aspects. One is that we have been looking at plastics for quite a while now. So like the processes are established. And if we think about new, for example, biodegradable plastics, these are just at the beginning of their lives, basically, or at the research, and then it's always more expensive. Okay, so as soon as we get them up and running, and if there are more of these produced, the prices will drop. So this is one. And the other thing is that, as Julia nicely explained, plastics that we use in our daily lives is usually from crude oils, right? And the prices there are just so low. So as soon as the prices will go up for oil, also the price for plastic will go up, and that will make all the bioplastics much more interesting immediately.
Got it. Julia, what are your thoughts?
So yes, one of the things is the price. I think at the moment they're just so cheap to produce because the source materials are cheap and they're made in huge bulks and they're very light, so they're easy to transport. It's much more expensive to transport steel parts than just some plastic sheets that you can really transport easily. And I think one of the biggest points with plastic is we never thought about end of life, right? Something that's really just coming up in the last 20 years where we really think about end of life. But even here, it's something I hear a lot about in the news. I hear a lot about it here in our labs, but I don't hear much about it like being actually enforced in policy. And as a company, you're trying to make money. So until it's enforced with policy, I think many companies won't change. But as soon as it happens, for an increase that for a consumer is tiny, you won't even notice. This is maybe a cent, for a consumer.
Right.
But for a company, this is a lot of money. And so I think as a consumer, we won't see prices skyrocket and explode. But as a company, the profits will shrink a bit if they have to make it recyclable. But they can. They're just trying to save money at the moment.
Well, it's shifting priorities. How about we put it that way?
Yes.
So we have a couple questions for the audience I'd just like to address. And the first one really is for you, Nicole. It's about how do you actually print the salt template? Going back to the beginning of our conversation, what printing method do you use to print that template?
So sadly, I can't disclose everything because we need to play a bit with our magic boxes from time to time. What works usually with a lot of materials, and this is also published, is in advanced materials, is that we extrude an ink, which has a property similar to Nivea cream, you can think of, where there are like salt particles in a liquid dispersed, and we basically extrude it through a nozzle, and we just put like one layer after the other, and we build it up on top of each other. And then basically it's just sintered, so we put it in the oven to glue the salt particles together, and this gives us our scaffolds.
Excellent. Thank you. And for Julia, just as you are looking towards the research you're doing now and some of the comments you've made about cost and price and how expensive it is to do basic research, what are the biggest challenges that you face as a scientist in material science?
So I'm going to be completely honest and a bit philosophical here. And I think this is across science, is at the moment science is extremely competitive. Mm-hmm. Extremely competitive. There's lots of scientists who are all competing for the same money. We're all competing for the same journals where we want to publish. And so sometimes I feel like we ignore, or at least don't prioritize, quality as much as we could. I think if you look at older publications and you see, I tried this 700 times and these are my results. And newer publications is, I tried this 3 times and these are my results. And so I really hope that we can get a bit of a balance back where we can be less competitive and more join forces for a common cause, rather than always try and be like that 1 month quicker than the people in the US who are doing very similar things. So I can get this big publication, and instead, if we work together, we could achieve much more.
Nicole, what are you thinking of the biggest challenges? When you wake up in the morning and go into the lab, what are the biggest challenges you're facing?
To get the lab too dirty? No, I'm kidding. Well, it's actually a challenge sometimes. No, but like I agree with Julia. This is a problem generally also from the academics, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's also to get the people thinking about materials, because I think also with the recycling, the problem is we're not thinking of what's happening with all the stuff that we have around us, and if there is a bit more thoughts going into what we actually use in every day, from companies, from the governments. I think this could really give us a push to bring the materials we produce in the lab also like to commercialize them and bring them to the people, whether it is bioplastics, which might be a bit more expensive, but they could actually solve big problems, or new biodegradable implants, which at the moment are really challenging to get to the market because of all the really high restrictions in the medical sector.
Got it. So Nicole, if I were to see you in 5 years, I know that you will definitely have your PhD all finished. But will you be a research scientist, or are you thinking about, being an entrepreneur, taking the stuff you've done and making it into a company, or what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, we're actually currently setting everything up for a startup. So as soon as I get my thesis done and submitted and defended, we, like my friend Simona Filman and I, are actually going into the startup scene, because this was always why I studied material science. I wanted to change something really, and this for me, it's really going from the beginning, so from the research all the way to the commercialization of the product in the end. So I think we can only do a change if we actually bring it to reality in the end.
So is there a name or a website that people should follow if they want to see what's coming up next, Nicole?
Yes, please. So follow us on LinkedIn. We actually have a page. It's called Salea with 2 L. So I can type it in the chat. So for everyone who's interested, please follow us, and we will be really happy to see you there. Yeah, so at the moment I need to finish my PhD, but we are always working on how we can continue our journey on that path.
And Julia, a final question before we close. Same question. Where do you see yourself in a few years? And is there a startup in your future?
I really hope so. So same as Nicole, we're both like, finish our PhDs now quickly. But also for me, I'm thinking about doing a startup. I'm not as far along as Nicole. Also, my idea came much later in my PhDs than hers. So I'm still in the baby shoes, but I'm really thinking about it, and I'm really excited that there is the opportunity to really make something and take it out into the world and see it applied and see it used. And I think that would be super rewarding to have that chance of changing something, even if it's something small.
Very cool. So thank you both. Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you very much, Nicole. Thank you very much for being our guides as we went through our virtual vernissage and being the artists, the scientists, and the researchers who really made this happen. I'd like to close today's discussion on behalf of the ETH in Zurich, the Swiss Institute of Technology, as well as the Swiss Consulate in Atlanta, and also thank the Atlanta Design Festival for giving us the opportunity to talk about this today. And thank everyone who has joined us for joining in our conversation, exploring materials and exploring their future. Thank you. Please stay safe, and we look forward to exploring the future of materials together.